Dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for the next invitation to the next Primakov Readings, which traditionally gather a solid composition of participants. These are prominent politicians, scientists, experts, public figures from many countries of the world. I am very glad that interest in this forum remains, in my opinion, even growing in modern conditions. Reading is inextricably linked with the name and legacy of Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov. It was he who many years ago justified the concept of a multipolar world and accurately predicted that the strengthening of multipolar principles would become the main trend of world development in the first half of the 21st century. And apparently much longer. And most likely, the movement towards a new world order will take a historical era, and we are just at the beginning of the road. But it is clear that in the mid-90s, Primakov's Doctrine gave such a theoretical philosophical answer to concepts like the end of history, the clash of civilizations, the end of autocracies. And now it's clear who was right. Those who predicted like-mindedness and the total domination of the Western liberal world order, or Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, our teacher, who pushed us to the right side of history, and to the right main road forward to the development of humanity on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. President Putin said this very accurately at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum when he said that we are not forming together with the People's Republic of China, other like-minded people. We are not artificially forming some kind of new world order, we are formalizing it. We just help objective processes develop as efficiently and as quickly as possible. In 1996 year, Yevgeny Maximovich published his program article, which was called International Relations on the Eve of the 21st Century. 96th year of the last century. Problems and prospects. There he emphasized that the main mechanism that can ensure a smooth, least painful transition to a multipolar democratic world is the United Nations. And that one should not reinvent the wheel, but simply strictly observe what is enshrined in the UN Charter. First of all, the principles of sovereign equality of states, which, in fact, are the basis of multipolarity. Now many people are talking about the need to replace the Yalta-Potsdam system. It depends on what it is about. If we are talking about the international legal framework, then it is not necessary to change the Charter. Read it, it is the fairest international document that has ever been adopted by almost all states inhabiting our planet without exception. Another thing is that the principles laid down there are not applied by everyone, either violated or torn out of the general context. Applied selectively, while we persistently advocate that the implementation of the principles of the Charter must be achieved in their entirety and interrelationship. Our Western colleagues, as you know, apply a logic that fits into their philosophy of a rules-based order. No one has seen the rules, but they apply them. When Yugoslavia was being destroyed, it was necessary to tear Kosovo away from Serbia. And they said that there was no need to hold a referendum. The High Representative Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland, was involved in this. Who was looking after the dialogue between the Kosovars and Serbia, he just said, wrote some kind of report, that they have been talking for so long, nothing is working. Perhaps it's time to declare independence. And without a referendum, without anything. They just announced that Kosovo is now and henceforth independent. The West immediately supported all this. The president often talks about it. Well, just let me remind you again, it's too tempting such a screaming example. The West has declared that this is the right of a nation to self-determination. And when in 2008 year, and when in 6 years, responding, and there, in Kosovo, there was no fighting, no one burned anyone, no one was shot. There was a peace process going on. They just said, it's very long, tedious, let's somehow wind up this whole shop. And when the Crimeans and Donbass, in response to the bloody and illegal coup, refused to listen and obey the putschists who came to power illegally, held a referendum in Crimea, and declared the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the West immediately became nervous and said that this was a gross violation of the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. I am sure there will be more questions on this topic, and I will be ready to discuss this aspect in more detail, discuss it with you. The attitude of the West towards human rights is screaming. Article 1 of the Charter requires respect for the human rights of every individual, regardless of race, gender, language, and religion. Well, you know what has been done with the Russian language in Ukraine by these neo-Nazi rulers, and what kind of fate is in store for the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The West, which, discussing any situation in the world, be it Venezuela, Iran, the People's Republic of China, Russia, of course, and now Hungary, and many, many other subjects, the West invariably puts demands to respect human rights at the forefront. Has anyone ever heard a combination of human rights in the assessments that the West expresses about the actions of the Kyiv regime over the past 11 years after the coup there? And on the contrary, both Ursula von der Leyen's and Kai Kallas, and before that Giuseppe Borrelli and Micheli, keep repeating at every step that we need to pump weapons and money into Ukraine, ensuring its offensive against Russia, ensuring, after all, this illusory goal of inflicting strategic defeat on Russia. And the main argument is because Ukraine defends European values. Here you are. The attitude towards human rights towards Russians shows that neo-Nazi tendencies and Nazi instincts have not disappeared anywhere in Europe. Recently, the European Commissioner for Enlargement, some kind of CAS, I don't remember, said that Ukraine has fulfilled all the conditions necessary to start negotiations on joining the European Union, and we can start. That's it. That's all there was to know about democracy, as it has now transformed in the European Union. It is in order to avoid such perverted interpretations of the Charter through double standards that we supported a couple of years ago Venezuela's initiative to create a group of friends in New York in defense of the UN Charter. It now has more than 20 people, and those who wish want to join. The group is active. We accept statements on a regular basis, including a statement has just been adopted, or it will be released today about what is happening in the Middle East. But first of all, in connection with the aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and this group of like-minded people, it has very good prospects. It was on her initiative that the General Assembly in December last year approved by vote, but by a solid majority, for the first time approved a resolution on the need to counter modern practices of neo-colonialism. We can also talk about this, about how, having received political freedom, the former colonies, primarily African ones, did not receive economic equality, as required by the same Charter of the United Nations. Now, by the way, the second wave of liberation of Africa is rising interestingly. More and more African friends are paying attention to the fact that they are still being pumped out of them mostly. Their entire economy is mainly based on pumping natural resources out of them, and in fact all the added value is produced and pocketed by the former Western metropolises and other members of the European Union and NATO. I will also say one thing that is very important, especially in the year of the 80th anniversary of the Great Victory. This is a clear trend towards the revival of Nazism, despite the mandatory and respected verdict of the Nuremberg Tribunal by all. This is a direct path to the revision of the entire post-war international legal architecture. In the West and in Europe, I have no doubt, they know this and probably for the same purpose. They are trying to encourage neo-Nazi, Nazi tendencies on the part of the Ukrainian regime, the Baltic states, and a number of other countries, hoping that in line with their concept of a rules-based order, they use these processes, these trends, in order to cause maximum damage to Russia, or, as they say, to restrain Russia. But now the truth is already being told, not to restrain it, but to defeat it. Otherwise it will destroy Europe itself in 3 or 4 years. The position of the UN-Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, a citizen of Portugal, a member state of the European Union and NATO, causes great regret. He not only regularly and openly abuses his powers, refuses, despite our numerous demands, to call a spade, and even assist in obtaining basic information. As, for example, it happens with our repeated requests to use his authority to present us with a list of the names of those people whose corpses were shown by BBC journalists in Bucha in April 2022 year. Despite the fact that an investigation was announced, no one even now stutters about any results of the investigation. Well, except for us. But there are no names of those people for whose sake, as they say, for whose fate, and in memory of the sacrifices they made. Everything was started, another wave of sanctions was adopted, and so on. I'm not talking about the 14th year. There is no investigation into who burned 50 people alive in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa. Although no investigation is necessary and not necessary, all of them, these people, are captured on video materials that only need to be deciphered, and there is nothing more to talk about. Therefore, the revival of Nazism, and the way it is perceived in the West, either turn a blind eye to it, or actively encourage it. Everything is fine, just to hurt Russia, as they believe, both physically on the battlefield, and morally, politically undermining, and trying to erase from history the great victory that was won over fascism, primarily by the efforts and sacrifices of our people. And speaking of how officials like the UN Secretary General Mr. Guterres violate Article 100 of the Charter of the United Nations, which require impartiality and limit their functions to administrative matters. The same example, unfortunately, is followed by the leadership of UNESCO, which, by a brilliant example, declared Odessa, the center of Odessa, a cultural heritage of humanity, a couple of weeks after the barbarians demolished the monument to Catherine II, who founded this city, and, in principle, under which the whole region was being settled, cities, ports, factories were built there. And from other organizations, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, whose Director General simply went along with the West in direct violations, obvious blatant violations of the Convention on the Conclusion of Chemical Weapons, which requires any changes to the format of interaction within this framework solely on the basis of consensus. They didn't give a damn about all this. Consensus, as an integral basis for the functioning of the structure, is also an OSCE rule. In the same way, the heads of the OSCE Secretariat and the elected, incoming countries from the European Union, from NATO, this is violated in the grossest way. What are the OSCE chairmen currently doing in Finland? Preparing a certain event in August dedicated to the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, and without revealing their plan. And according to our information, some cell events are being prepared, separate gatherings. There are no discussions about where we, the OSCE members, have been led by the policy of the West. But it's just that the Finns will then write some kind of final document and will loudly celebrate the anniversary for the whole world. But the fact that not all countries of the world, even the vast majority of countries of the world, do not like these trends at all, do not like the attempts of the West to rewrite history at all. This was vividly evidenced by the participation of many dozens of leaders of the leading states of the global majority in the events on the occasion of the Great Victory on the 9th of May this year on Red Square. I'm not going to talk in detail about what our specific approaches to resolving the Ukrainian crisis are. The President has once again confirmed them in extreme detail. They never changed. I confirmed them during a discussion at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. By the way, unlike us, the approaches of Western, so-called leaders, they are constantly changing, reflect in general the failure of all their original plans. Do you remember how it all started? Russia needs to inflict a strategic defeat on the battlefield. They shouted simply, to the point of hysteria. After some time, the slogan changed, and they began to loudly declare that Russia should not win in Ukraine. And now they are demanding, asking, begging for an immediate truce without preconditions. This is exactly what Zelensky categorically refused a couple of years ago, when he still lived and worked, under the slogan of strategic defeat on the battlefield. The fiasco of Western strategy and tactics is obvious, but Europe is still trying. Two circumstances are particularly disturbing, by and large. We have never had any illusions about NATO, and we have had no illusions about the European Union for a long time. Remember, when the Ukrainian discussions were just beginning, even before the coup, we always said that Ukraine should be committed to the principles on the basis of which it became independent, on the basis of which, in fact, we recognized its independence. The President repeated them: a non-aligned neutral status and, accordingly, a nuclear-free status, as recorded in the Declaration of Independence. Then we said that NATO, this is an aggressive bloc, its meaning of its existence. It's only to look for all the enemies. Here they found it after Russia restored its rightful position in the world in the early noughties, the 10th years. Here we found Russia. After they escaped from Afghanistan, the Russian Federation became a common enemy. Therefore, we insist that Ukraine's commitments to remain non-aligned are fully respected. As for the European Union, but this is an economic association created in order to make it better in the socio-economic sense. For the inhabitants of European countries, I have nothing against it. Since then, there has been a radical transformation of the European Union, and this transformation continues into an aggressive military political bloc, in fact a branch, but rather an appendage of NATO. They signed an agreement with NATO a couple of years ago, according to which, when NATO is required, and such plans are announced, it will be necessary to move its troops and equipment to the east. Then not NATO members, but you members will be obliged to provide their territory. In other words, they are directly involved in the preparation of a war against our country. And Germany's position is also very worrying. For some time now, together with Italy and Japan, it has been voting at the UN General Assembly against our annual resolution on the inadmissibility of the glorification of Nazism. And in addition, he assumes the role of a leader in supporting the Nazi Kyiv regime, pumping it with finances and weapons. Now they have come up with a scheme according to which they will allegedly produce weapons on the territory of Ukraine. Many objective observers have already given facts according to which nothing like this will happen. This is just a cover in order to supply weapons from Germany, from other European countries, to the Ukrainian armed forces, referring to the fact that this is not support, not pumping weapons, but assistance in establishing their own production. And a lot of such tricks are conceived and implemented. And the fact that MERS is recently in line with such a deep physical involvement of Germany in the conflict, in the context of the supplies that he threatens, the supply of Taurus, which cannot be controlled without the direct participation of soldiers and officers of the Bundeswehr. In addition, he stated as soon as he took office that his priority was to make the German army the strongest in Europe again. Of course, such statements say that the ruling circles of modern Germany have forgotten about the dark pages of their history, and it's time for them to come to their senses before it's too late. Here, the West is not limited to deterring only Russia. It behaves defiantly aggressively towards any manifestations of independence, including in its own ranks. You know, there are sound voices in the European Union and in NATO, not pro-Russian, but voices that declare their preference to be guided by national interests and not by what Ursula von der Leyen will come up with in Brussels. Among the members of other members of the European Commission, whom no one has ever elected, and whose composition is the subject of such a closed behind-the-scenes bargaining between the leaders of national governments, countries.
такого закрытого закулисного торга между руководителями национальных правительств стран Евросоюза.
And it is impossible not to see the risks in the fact that NATO is going beyond its traditional responsibility zone, trying to gain a foothold in the Middle East, Transcaucasia, Central Asia, and the Arctic, and in the Asia-Pacific region. The West is actively promoting Indo-Pacific strategies that are aimed frankly at the collapse of that universal and open security architecture that has been created for decades on the basis of the philosophy and around the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Asians. The need to form a united anti-Chinese front is openly stated, as US Secretary of Defense Hexit did at the recent Shangri-La International Forum in Singapore. I am sure there will be some questions on this topic too, and I will be happy to talk about it. Escalation of tension in the Middle East as a result of the military action of Israel and the United States against Iran, including the objects of its peaceful nuclear program. This was done in gross violation of the UN Charter and the IAEA Charter, UN resolutions, and the same IAEA, which requires not to touch peaceful nuclear facilities, and in general, this is required by generally recognized norms of international law. References to the right to self-defense, I think, cannot mislead anyone, because not a single fact, not even a single suspicion has been presented regarding the version that Iran either attacked or was preparing an attack on Israel. By the way, international law does not encourage the preventive use of force against a state that has not attacked someone who wants to use this force. And it is clear that further destabilization of the Middle East, the use of methods such as political assassinations, to eliminate both military leaders and scientists threatens serious shocks for global security, for the world economy, and especially for the regime of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. On the whole, the picture is, of course, alarming, but as you know, we always strive, as Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov bequeathed, in any crisis, as our Chinese friends advise us. In any crisis, look for opportunities to move forward. And we believe that it is very important, including in light of the fact that NATO is encroaching on the whole of Eurasia, on the Far East, and spreading its ambitions everywhere to the Pacific Ocean. We believe it is necessary to look for new ways, new forms of the Eurasian security architecture to replace the completely bankrupt Euro-Atlantic models. And in the architecture we are talking about, we consider it important to provide for the participation of all states and associations located on our continent without exception. There is an African Union in Africa, along with numerous subregional structures. Latin America has CILAC, along with subregional integration organizations, and Eurasia, the largest continent, the richest, the most promising continent, where many great civilizations have historically been created and remain, has separate integration processes, but no unifying forum that would be continent-wide, as in Africa and Latin America, does not exist.
Объединяющего форума, который был бы общеконтинентальным, как в Африке и в Латинской Америке, не существует.
Therefore, the concepts based on Euro-Atlantic principles, they have, in my opinion, discredited themselves completely, starting with NATO.
Начиная с НАТО,
I will also take the European Union here, given that it has now essentially fallen under NATO. And the OSCE, of course, is also a Euro-Atlantic undertaking. By the way, when the Yeltsin meeting was being prepared, the Soviet Union proceeded from the fact that the organization, the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe, should unite countries from the Atlantic to the Urals, roughly speaking. And the European participants insisted that their North American colleagues were also invited. So they were invited, and since then, they have dictated all their terms to their NATO allies first of all. And the strengthening of security on the Eurasian continent, of course, is also facilitated by the Russian-Chinese relations of comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. This is a benchmark of cooperation between great powers, an important stabilizer in the international arena. And, of course, the personal diplomacy of our leaders Putin and Xi Jinping plays a huge role. We also see a very positive impact on the situation of the Russian-Belarusian strategic partnership and alliance, within the framework of which an agreement on security guarantees within the framework of the Union State was recently concluded. By the way, we support the initiative of Belarus, which annually hold conferences in Minsk on Eurasian security issues. Together with our Belarusian colleagues, we are promoting the project of the Eurasian Charter and diversity and multipolarity in the 21st century, mentioning the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement between Russia and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It gives stability to the world, not only in the Northeast Asia region, but also in the Eurasian and Pacific context. I would like to note the importance and potential of a particularly privileged strategic partnership with India. And here, too, the legacy of Yulia Maximovich Primakov is well known. Many years ago, he took the initiative to form a non-bureaucratic troika of the RICs of Russia, India, and China. And since then, she has been meeting regularly for the past few years. Now we have a pause, the pandemic intervened, and then the aggravation on the border between India and China also served as a break. But now, given the reports that these exacerbations are softening, we expect that the work of the RIC will be restored. And Yevgeny Maximovich also proceeded from the fact that one of the prerequisites for the formation of a multipolar world is the democratization of world economic relations, the rejection of their politicization, using illegal unilateral sanctions, which are increasingly becoming the forerunner of an armed attack, be it Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, now Iran. When the West resorts to using unfair competition tools, including tariff wars, seizures of sovereign assets, abuse of the role of its currencies and payment systems, in fact, the West itself has buried the model of globalization, which it built for its interests after the end of the Cold War. Therefore, Russia, together with our like-minded people, actively participates in the formation of mechanisms for ensuring foreign trade that are not controlled by the West. Transport corridors and alternative payment platforms, value chains. This was discussed a lot at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and CILAC are actively engaged in this. We have heard President Lula's position on this. The African Union is also thinking about this. And in general, when we talk about the desire to make the Eurasian continent more purposeful, represented in the world economy, and use its God-given advantages, including transit routes, natural resources, and much more, We encourage the development of ties between organizations that have been created and work on this continent, including in the economic sphere.
Включая транзитные пути, природные ресурсы и многое другое, мы поощряем развитие связей между организациями, которые в том числе и в сфере экономики созданы и работают на этом континенте.
These are the Eurasian Economic Union, ASEANUS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Cooperation Council of the Arab States of the Persian Gulf. There is a Cooperation Council in South Asia and the Central Asian Five, also an organic part of this entire space.
И Центральноазиатская пятерка тоже органичная часть всего этого пространства.
Well, all these integration projects can be successfully combined with the Chinese Big Belt and Road Project. So by encouraging contacts and harmonizing programs between all these structures, we see the prospect of creating what President Putin called a great Eurasian partnership. In conclusion, I would like to say that Yevgeny Maximovich has always believed that contradictions between world players, especially between leading countries that bear special responsibility for international security, should not serve as an obstacle to dialogue and joint work. We fully agree with this advice of our great predecessor. Today, despite all the deep differences between Moscow and Washington, we supported and agreed with the proposal of the Trump administration after it came to power to resume bilateral dialogue without preconditions, and to begin professional, concrete, without propaganda, and without politicization discussion of ways to resume the normalization of bilateral relations.
Обсуждение путей возобновления путей нормализации двусторонних отношений.
Of course, this process is not easy. It is enough to look at the situation on the world stage in which this dialogue is developing. It is not fast, of course, but it is quite there with perseverance, and with each side showing responsibility for the fate of the world. It may well go to the benefit of all mankind, including for preventive discussions and crisis prevention like the ones we are seeing now.
И предотвращение кризисов наподобие тех, которые мы сейчас наблюдаем.
And Europe, which once again in history literally ignites another big war, has hardly anything to offer in the conditions of its marginalization in world affairs. We are also observing this. And now, the European Union can hardly be considered as one of the significant poles of the objectively emerging multipolar world. But under all circumstances, as the President said, we are ready for an honest search for a balance of interests, with everyone who is ready for such work honestly, on an equal basis, and where possible we will respond. Let those who broke off relations with us to the detriment of their peoples, bearing enormous financial and reputational losses, let this, changing the transmission of Fyodor Lukyanov, this international oborzony will end, let them, realizing their mistakes, come to us and offer what they came with. And we will decide depending on our interests. Thank you very much. Sergey Yuryevich, thank you very much for your analysis of current and future problems of modern international relations. And now we turn to the questions. We have about 35 minutes, and let me ask the first question. 4.5 hours ago, there was supposed to be a truce in the Middle East. Yesterday, Mr. President, you met with Iranian Foreign Minister Araki. What scenarios do you see? Do you believe in the coming of this truce? What are your ratings on this? But the assessments were presented, including by the President and your humble servant. Our position is very simple, and the main thing that the Russian President stressed yesterday during a meeting with Minister Araki is that our proposals on how to resolve this situation were made quite a long time ago. They were made in the course of confidential contacts with the Americans, the Israelis, and the Iranian side, including during high-level conversations. Both Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran reacted positively. But nothing has followed in practical terms to implement the ideas that were put forward. But we do not want to cover them in detail now, but I can say that they were aimed at overcoming the main contradiction. The desire of the United States and Israel to reach an agreement by violating the fundamental right of Iran, like any other country, to enrich uranium in the context of the implementation of peaceful nuclear programs. There was a denouement that seemed realistic to us. And yesterday, the President repeated that we are still ready, if the parties directly involved are interested in this and ask us to participate. He emphasized that we do not impose ourselves as intermediaries in any way. As for the announcements that have been coming from Washington, from Israel, from Tehran, since 1 o'clock in the morning, in my opinion, it is very difficult now to make any final conclusion and get a clear picture, because President Trump has declared that everything is forever eternal. Now there is peace, there is an agreement. It is reported that the Americans persuaded Israel to agree to a ceasefire and to establish an indefinite truce. That our Qatari friends played a similar role in relation to Tehran. We will only welcome if such an agreement exists. But after its announcement, there were reports of strikes, of an exchange of strikes between Israel and Iran. Therefore, but let's not make any hasty conclusions based on fragmentary information now. But we are for peace. Thank you. Please, colleagues, who wants to ask questions, please introduce yourself. What else do you put masks on a girl? Viktor Kyiv, member of the Public Council of the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. I have this question. Sergey Viktorovich, well, first of all, thank you very much for such extensive information about the current situation, including the vision of Russia. And the question is this. Here we are all witnesses of how the Minsk agreements were just a cover, right? Then it was already said with Western leaders that they were a cover in order to arm Ukraine. We have seen as witnesses now how the West's commitment to negotiations with Iran was declared about, well, let's say, a peaceful solution to the issue of the atom. And at the same time, a decision was made to attack, including Iranian nuclear facilities. This is how, under such conditions, we will conduct and are currently conducting negotiations with the West, including the United States, when trust is actually under question, and how to achieve a result so as not to end up getting, as usual, we were deceived. Thank you. Thank you. It is far from the first time in history when the West turns out to be incompetent. Well, one of the most striking examples is the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when Hitler needed to prepare better for the war against the Soviet Union, what he was doing. Now, too, the Minsk agreements, which were also guaranteed and signed by Germany, were also used to prepare a war against the Russian Federation. How much can the West be trusted? I believe that even Reagan's trust but verify formula is insufficient. There are different ways to check. It can be checked by agreeing in some agreement on mechanisms for verifying the execution of agreements. It can be checked through special services and political and military intelligence. As you know, the SFR actively monitors actions that cause direct damage to the Russian Federation. But it will be necessary to think. We will need reinforced concrete guarantees, of course, enshrined in the Security Council resolution. Although, I repeat, the West will have already trampled on these guarantees of the Security Council many times. As it was in Kosovo, when he violated the resolution consolidating Serbia's sovereignty over this Serbian region. And, by the way, demanding that Serbian policemen, border guards, and customs officers be present on the territory of Kosovo. Categorically, there is not a NATO base there, the largest in the Balkans, and NATO forces, the so-called Kyiv Ford. They simply do not let them go there. When they are told, it is written in the resolution. Your resolution. And again, the same mantra that they uttered during the period of our demands to abandon the expansion of NATO to the east, because they not only promised it verbally, but also enshrined it in OSCE documents. Not to strengthen its own security at the expense of the security of others. No organization in the Euro-Atlantic space can claim dominance. We present all of this to them. They said our political commitments. We say, yes, it was signed by the presidents. So what? The answer was, legal guarantees of security can be obtained only within the framework of the North Atlantic Alliance. In other words, they deliberately created such a magnet from NATO and forcibly stimulated the desire of regimes like Zelensky to deny everything else, to discard contacts with everyone except the North Atlantic Alliance. But it is difficult for me to say now what mechanisms, but for sure, if and when, I hope, when such a conversation with the West will resume. With the Americans, we are still far from an essential discussion of strategic stability issues. But when he resumes such a conversation, both with the Americans and when the Europeans come to their senses and get over it, I'm sorry for the huge word, it will be necessary to look very carefully at how to guarantee security so as not to repeat past mistakes. As for the Iranian situation, now, only yesterday there was a meeting of the Security Council on Sunday evening. There was a meeting of the UN Security Council, convened by us, the Chinese and the Pakistanis. And yesterday, on Monday, there was an emergency meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors. There are very funny things have become clear. Well, I'll refresh my memory of the background. A few weeks ago, the Director General of the IAEA, Mr. Grossi, began to prepare a comprehensive report on the situation around the Iranian nuclear program. And in this report, the IAEA Secretariat could describe the same facts in different ways. For example, in the 2015 year, when Security Council Resolution 2231 was adopted, it approved a joint comprehensive plan of action for a complete, final settlement of the situation around the Iranian nuclear program. At that time, before making such a verdict, first in the IAEA, and then in the UN Security Council, information about the fact that at 3 sites in Iran, the names are not important, and the IAEA, during such regular inspections, found some light traces of radioactive substances. And all this was analyzed at that moment, and in the 2015 year. Yes, and these objects, traces of radioactive, they were dated, as the IAEA found out at the time, in the 2003 year. After that, there were no additional factors there. And in the 2015 year, it was decided that we had reviewed everything. That is, including this episode with 3 objects. There was no evidence that would say that Iran was trying to introduce military elements into its peaceful nuclear program. On the basis of this conclusion, the decisions of the EMT Board of Governors were made with this safety as well. Then, in the 2019 year, Donald Trump, during his first coming, withdrew from this joint comprehensive plan of action. It is very funny here the role of the European Troika, which, along with the United States, Russia and China, participated in these processes of preparing this plan, Britain, France and Germany. They lamented, but there was no criticism of the United States. And some time later, they began to demand from Iran, why don't you let inspectors on any additional inspections, additional visits? And Iran said, we are doing everything that is stipulated by the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Safeguards Agreement with the IAEA, like everyone else, no more, no less, but no more. Because everything from above, it was within the framework of the deal on the Iranian nuclear program, in exchange for counter steps by the West, primarily in the context of the gradual lifting of sanctions. The Europeans took a purely imperial neo-colonial position. No. Don't follow the examples of the United States. They can, but you can't. You have to do everything. They were preparing in Vienna, in the capital, at the headquarters of the IAEA before the recent meeting. When the report of Mr. Grossi, the Director General, was submitted to, they actively processed it, so that he put the most ambiguously negative wording in his paper. Which he did. And picking up these formulations, these 3 called the Americans, submitted a resolution to the Board of Governors condemning the fact that Iran is not fully fulfilling what Washington has destroyed. And a few days later, Israel launched its strikes. In other words, such a logical chain is being built here. And I think that part of the blame of the Europeans is that this happened, and that such attacks were carried out. It is, of course, present. And now Mr. Sadness, who gave the pitch by and large. He could have written a more clear report. Now he is demanding that Iran immediately provide access to the IAEA to nuclear facilities, to make sure where your enriched material is located, and generally look at what and how there. Are there any guarantees that it won't leak? I don't see any such guarantees. Find out. You know, we beat and beat, we didn't find anything there. Did you hide it somewhere? Show me where. Well, this is the CEO of a respected, in general, agency. This is to the question of what I was talking about from the rostrum, that the West has a very serious influence on the secretariats of international organizations. To a certain extent, he even privatized them, because Western employees of the secretariats of international structures, starting with saunas. In other situations, of course, most of them are not guided by the requirements of impartiality, and a ban on receiving instructions from any government,
получения указаний от каких-либо правительств.
Please, colleagues, who has any questions? Please. Thank you very much, Ambara Frain from Pakistan. Thank you very much for your performance. Pakistan has always taken a responsible approach to using second chances. I would like to ask how principled sovereignty can act within the framework of the territorial integrity of the violating states, since all the rights of all states must be respected within the framework of law. During a long discussion, I tried to mention the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity in the context of all the principles that make up the Charter of the United Nations. They must all be fulfilled, and the main thing is that there is no contradiction between sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the right of a nation to self-determination, which the West justified the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo. And immediately after the creation of the UN, many people noticed that the Charter speaks about the right of nations to self-determination. And also after the right of a nation to self-determination, it speaks about the territorial integrity of states. And the process was launched, especially after decolonization in the 60s of the last century, when the process of decolonization, initiated primarily by the Soviet Union and our friends from the so-called socialist camp, began rapidly. After all, in fact, it was the embodiment of the principle of self-determination of peoples. If at the head of it, if the principle of territorial integrity was put at the forefront, then this would mean perpetuating the metropolises with their conquests in Africa and in other parts of the globe. And then they drew attention to this apparent contradiction between territorial integrity and the right of a nation to self-determination. Negotiations have been going on for several years, and as a result, a detailed declaration on the principles of relations between states based on the UN Charter was adopted, several dozen pages in small print. And in the part that concerns our topic, it was said there, everyone is obliged to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states whose governments, attention, respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, and therefore have. And because of this, they represent the government, represent the entire population living in the relevant territory. In the process of decolonization. But did London, Madrid, Paris, Lisbon, did they represent the interests of the population, of the African territories that they owned after the wars of conquest? Of course not. And African countries did not think so. This helped to provide such a solid international legal basis for the process of decolonization. Similarly, after the coup in Ukraine, did the fascists who came to power, and who first of all declared that they were on February 24th for the 2014th year, they said that they would cancel the status of the Russian language. They sent armed militants to storm the Crimean parliament, which refused to recognize the results of the coup, as well as Donbass. Did they represent the interests of these people? They called them terrorists because they refused to obey. Neither Crimea nor Donbass launched hostilities against the part of Ukraine that was under the control of neo-Nazis. These putschists sent combat planes and tanks to the territories we are talking about. It is categorically prohibited by international humanitarian law to use combat aircraft, artillery, and other armed forces in your country. Nobody says anything about it. Just as no one talks about the crime I mentioned in Odessa on the 2nd of May, 2000 of the 14th year, when people were simply burned alive. And in this sense, of course, everyone is obliged to recognize, but Zelensky and his team do not represent. As it should be called more decently, I do not even know, they do not represent the inhabitants of either Crimea, Donbass, or Novorossiya. If there is on the internet, please, I can ask my colleagues later, we can distribute it to everyone present. A selection of quotes about how these guys who came to power as a result of a coup characterized the Russian residents of Ukraine. Even Poroshenko, when he ran for election in May of the 2014 year, under the flag of a peacemaker. Like Zelensky, by the way, a few weeks later he unleashed, in general, it is now clear. With the encouragement of Germany and France, he unleashed a war against Donbass, demanding full submission from them. And said, it's all on the internet, who remembers everything, that this war will be ours, victory. Our children will go to kindergartens, schools, universities, and their children, residents of Donbass, will rot in basements. This is the mildest thing that was said about those people who considered themselves Ukrainians, but Russian culture was granted the rights that the Russian language and Russian history were granted. Within the framework of the Constitution of Ukraine, terms like Rusnya, Inhumans, Yatsenyuk, the former prime minister under Poroshenko, called them Inhumans. Those who live in the Donbass and in the Crimea. And here is a good example. The ambassador of Ukraine recently, a couple of years ago in Kazakhstan, I don't remember the last name, Verbitsky, something like that, in a live broadcast of Kazakhstan television, answering questions, he said, our main task, kill as many Russians as possible when our children have less work left. This is right in the spirit of Mirza's statement that by fighting against Iran, Israel is doing dirty work for Europe. In the spirit of the Nazis, in full, as we say. Well, the hero himself, a servant of the people, in the 21st year in September, long before the special military operation, answering questions in an interview, including received such a question. Then there was still a line. There was already a line of contact between the Donbass in accordance with the Minsk agreements, which were still in force at that time. And the correspondent asks him, what do you think about the people who are on the other side of the contact line? This philosopher replied so thoughtfully, you know, there are people and there are creatures. Russian culture, Russian civilization, for the sake of happiness, and for the safety of your children and grandchildren. If you live in Ukraine, but you feel yourself involved in Russian culture, Russian civilization, for the sake of happiness, and for the safety of your children and grandchildren, going to Russia. That's all, strictly speaking, that it was necessary to know about how the principle of self-determination of peoples is refracted, through the words and actions of the Kyiv regime. But as for sovereignty, there is nothing to talk about at all. Ukraine has had no sovereignty since the coup d'etat, which was prepared by the Americans, the British, who are now artificially supported. But it does not really exist. They are fully accountable and dependent on Western curators, primarily at this stage of London and Brussels, Paris and Berlin, which have played out in earnest. Please, Fedor Vtolovsky, Director of the MO. Thank you, Sergey Viktorovich. In February of the 26th year I am here. In February of the 26th year, the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms between Russia and the United States expires. It is clear that in the current circumstances, a serious dialogue on this topic has been suspended. Do you see it possible to resume such a dialogue with the Americans at all? And can a binding agreement, similar to the current agreement, be reached in the future with the Trump administration? Not necessarily at all. In my opinion, Sergey Alexeyevich Ryabkov talked about this topic yesterday. We welcome the fact that, unlike Biden's team, the Trump administration is ready for dialogue. But at this stage, the dialogue has not yet reached the level that allows us to make judgments about the strategic objectives of this dialogue. Recently, the Americans asked to cancel or postpone consultations on the functioning of embassies, the so-called irritant. There was an agreement that we were moving from Istanbul, from other points to the capitals. They will come to Moscow for consultations with us, and then we will go to them in Washington. But somehow they didn't like it or they changed their mind, I don't know. But as for preparing the conditions for a strategic dialogue, for its resumption, I had quite positive feelings after we met together with Yuri Ushakov in Riyadh with Marco Rubio and with Mike Waltz, the then National Security Advisor. Because I'm saying this without risking violating any privacy rules, because Rubio, what I'm going to say now, he then said it publicly. And he said at the very beginning of our meeting in the Trump era, Trump's foreign policy is a policy based on national interests. It is much clearer to us when we talk to partners who have the same concept based on national interests, without any ideology, without any collective forms of mutual responsibility. And this applies to Russia, especially Russia, as another great power. And our principles are as follows. When, in the vast majority of cases, these interests will not coincide, with us and with you. But when they coincide, it would be a crime not to use this coincidence to translate it into mutually beneficial practical material projects in the field of economics, energy, high technology, space, and so on. And if, or rather, and in those cases, and there are most of them, when these interests do not coincide, then it is the sacred duty of the great powers not to allow this discrepancy to degrade into confrontation, especially into a hot one. We share this approach with both hands. He formulated what, under President Putin, our foreign policy in general is always guided by. We are always open to talk with everyone, to find compromises. And in the period, somewhere in the first decades of the 21st century, there are numerous examples when our readiness to reach mutually acceptable compromises, both in dialogue with NATO and in dialogue with the European Union, has been proven many times. And then all this was destroyed by those who decided that they began to talk to them in some tone of insubordinate, but in the tone of independent participants in the processes. Therefore, in principle, if we take it conceptually, we are on the right path, but we have not even firmly set our feet on it yet. But the road will be mastered by the walking, it is clear. Please, Shamilajeev, chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Kazakhstan, is a person who scrupulously and carefully preserves the memory of Evgeny Maximovich, who recently published a book of his speeches. Very, very short. Our role of the TOE is to keep it no. The next thing is how it turned out that our armed forces, that our nuclear stockpiles were destroyed faster than the Americans, when there was an agreement. Someone has to answer for this. And finally, as far as we can work on import substitution, because things are quite tense. Shamil asked one question, asked three. Breaking it. As for the World Trade Organization, we need to go back to the roots first of all. Americans, when they realized that the systems of globalization created by them, based on certain principles, including fair competition, inviolability of property, presumption of innocence, and so on, that this is a system of globalization that allowed them to dominate for decades, that it began to be used by competitors, primarily the People's Republic of China, which, as they say, on the American field, according to American rules, began to beat them. And quite seriously. And then they just blocked. Washington blocked the work of the dispute resolution body of the World Trade Organization, which has been for many years. They artificially created the absence of a quorum and retain it to this day. Therefore, there are hundreds, in my opinion, if not thousands of lawsuits from China in full compliance with the obligations to the toe of each country. They accumulate there, and do not give them any progress. As for what was there, I do not know. About who destroyed how. No, it's who destroyed the weapons, right. Well, I'm not even going to touch on this, because the START III treaty is for him. The current leadership of the Russian Federation is responsible for this treaty. We did not allow any exotic paragraphs there, which were in his predecessors, and allowed significant advantages to the Americans, including in terms of inspection and access to information about the state of our strategic forces. And the third question I call. Well, you know, the term import substitution arose, that they say, I was blocked here, I'll buy somewhere else. It is not relevant, in my opinion. We need to produce ourselves. The final question, please. Dear Sergey Viktorovich, thank you very much for the opportunity to communicate with you. Yes, the question is about attitude. Russia annually introduces and proposes a resolution of the General Assembly on combating the implementation of Nazism. And the dynamics of voting shows that over the past 2 or 3 years, the number of countries that are against has grown, in my opinion, from to 253. At one time, back in the 90s, the Italian philosopher Uberteca warned that fascism could be eternal, that it was not an exceptional phenomenon of the 20th century and could return. In your opinion, are these dynamics of the assembly voting statistics signs that, perhaps, Nazism, fascism, has some kind of future, it will have to be fought again? The main thing that worries us now is that he has a present, and we must now, suppressing this present, of course, do everything so that in the future he does not have the same chances to be reborn. Although many political scientists and experts believe that human nature, if we take collective humanity, contains a lot of prerequisites for a variety of concepts, movements, currents, and that in a certain part of the population, Nazi instincts will persist. I think this is such a passive position, and we need to do everything so that Nazism will never be revived again. Yes, this includes reminders by General Assembly resolutions. And you correctly said that after the start of a special military operation, this obedient herd, which the Biden administration, with the support of zealous, faceless officials in Brussels, drove into the anti-Russian camp, forced, as Hitler once did, to throw all military resources, well, except human resources, although there are also partially hidden there, against our country. As did Napoleon, as did Hitler. And now it's all happening again. And if you listen to the statements of the same Merz, well, just the whole gloss has fallen off their attempts to be respected members of the world community, to be an example of European values, democracy, and so on. We were not confused by the fact that these 50 votes suddenly appeared against our resolution, although it was the European Union, NATO, and those whom they were from Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, somewhere else they were scratching their heads. It's just a reflection of the command system. There is no special democracy there. Literally, a herd that is controlled and given orders. But the mutiny on the ship is already manifesting. We see this both in the ranks of NATO and in the ranks of the European Union. So far, single voices. But the essence of these votes is that we do not want the European bureaucracy, those who are appointed to positions, to tell us, the elected leader, what we need to do. And just as I quoted Rubio about the fact that Trump's foreign policy is based on national interests, they also want their policy to be based on national interests, to be respected, dictated to them. There is no consensus on giving up 100% of Russian energy carriers. Then we will come up with some kind of qualified majority rule. And why does Ursula von der Leyen decide this? Bring this up for discussion by all you members represented by legitimately elected governments. However, not everyone is legally elected there now. There are Romanians there too. There are a lot of nuances here, you know. But in addition to the overwhelming majority, 140 votes, this resolution received. Returning to the resolution on the inadmissibility of the glorification of Nazism. But this is only one job and in one structure. The most important thing is what we are seriously doing now on behalf of the President. School textbooks, other forms of education of young people from the very young years. This and, of course, the work on the restoration of monuments, on the preservation of monuments in our country, to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, but also on the territory of European countries. This is an opposition to companies demolishing these monuments. And I would say the initiation of processes against those who are these monuments, especially monuments that are on the graves, contrary to all international conventions, demolished, subjected to acts of vandalism. This is primarily, of course, the Kyiv regime, to a large extent, in the Baltic states, and in a number of other countries. The fight against the distortion of historical memory is now one of our main tasks. In the year of the 80th anniversary, this task was especially clearly not just formulated, but detailed. And this work will be permanent for us. Please. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. My name is Chowdy. I represent the newspaper Junk Chinese Youth. Dear Mr. Minister, we are now going to see the potential for ending the conflict between Israel and Iran. As you can see, the impact of the termination of this conflict on the course of the conflict in Ukraine. And Russia has played an important and peaceful role in resolving the Iran-Israel conflict. Accordingly, do you think that as a result, the United States will pay even more attention to Russia's position and interests on the Ukrainian issue? Thank you very much. You know, there is such a point of view that God grant that in the Middle East between Israel, Iran, and with the participation of the United States, all this continues as long as possible. They will have more headaches on this topic. And disappointment, as experts say, Trump's disappointment in Zelensky will only deepen. You know, they have such a proverb, the Americans, that it is impossible to go and chew gum. Now, if we apply this proverb, then probably this mentality will somehow be implemented in this situation. But for us it does not have any special meaning. If the countries that support the Nazi regime weaken this support, or even better, stop it, we will perceive it as an awareness of reality, including the essence of this regime and, most importantly, the real situation on the battlefield, on the ground, as they say. If this understanding does not happen, then everything else does not matter. Because it's easy to hope that right now they will get stuck in the Middle East, and it will be easier for us. Our actions do not depend on such constructions and conclusions. But the fact that the Middle East problem, it is real and not created artificially. This is a fact, and we know. I remember working at the UNBAC in New York. It was more than 20 years ago when Netanyahu spoke at the General Assembly, and he had such a big poster with a primitive image of a bomb. Bombs, as terrorists in the Russian Empire use. Such a circle, there is a wick here, and he showed that this is what Iran has. In other words, this is a question that has been hatched for a long time. And this is a deep contradiction, which is connected with understanding your existential interests, and understanding the existential interests of the country against which you want to prepare some long-term actions. It took a long time to mature, but no one attacked anyone. By the way, it is not banned in writ in Iran. There are synagogues there. Judaism is not prohibited, just as Hebrew is not prohibited in the Palestinian territories. The same settlers are used. Arabic is not banned in Israel. Nowhere, in any country, is any particular language, especially the official language, prohibited, except in Ukraine. And when this process started, when the Russians began to be treated in accordance with the quotes that I have reproduced to you here, a very small amount, this is a gross violation of the Minsk agreements approved by the UN Security Council. They continued to increase the bombing of Donbass, which was to become their territory, to destroy people, and prepared a plan for the forcible seizure of these territories for the purpose, and it was also known there. It was known that there were plans to create NATO bases in the Crimea. The British planned to create a base on the Sea of Azov. All this is known. This is a direct violation of the obligations not to bring NATO closer to our borders, not to create threats to our security. The threat to military security and the extermination, the legislative extermination of all Russian, these are the root causes, in the preservation of which we had no right to allow and will not allow, and we no longer allow. Therefore, it is unfair to say that these wars are somehow similar to each other. There is not a single fact when Iran has carried out any hostile actions against Israel. If there is a suspicion of a violation of the non-proliferation treaty, there are procedures by which the IAEA should check it. And she checked. The agency has been testing Iran's nuclear program in a way it has not tested anyone. Very inclusive. And there wasn't, except for the last report, which clearly incorrectly formulated the situation, and there was no evidence. By the way, after these strikes, Mr. Grossi immediately seemed to come to his senses and began to say, "We have no confirmation that Iran is somehow starting a military nuclear program. And therefore, when in this situation, the Israelis say we are sure, and the US says we are sure. This is the strongest blow to the multilateral mechanism for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because it turns out like this, there are international legal procedures. And they tell you, I don't care about these procedures, we have our own rules. And our rule is that if there is no proof, and I am sure, then I can do anything. That's the long-term danger of this situation. Thank you very much.